Few images in martial history carry as much weight as a highly skilled warrior fighting with a full-length sword in each hand. It's a staple of fantasy literature and role-playing games, as well as Hollywood fight choreography, the kind of striking visual that immediately signals a fighter of extraordinary skill and daring. But how much of this image is rooted in actual historical practice? Surprisingly, the answer turns out to be more complicated and more interesting than most people assume. Dual-wielding swords, or fighting with two-bladed weapons simultaneously, does have a genuine historical footprint. That said, it looks very different from the spinning, acrobatic displays we've come to expect from popular media. The real tradition is grounded in pragmatism, regional martial culture, and the hard realities of armed combat across centuries and continents. Understanding what dual wielding actually meant in historical context requires looking beyond the modern image. It means examining period fight manuals, archaeological evidence, surviving martial traditions, and the tactical circumstances under which carrying two blades made sense. It also means separating the genuine martial applications from the centuries of myth-making that have accumulated around the concept. What emerges is a picture of a practice that was real, documented, and sometimes highly effective, but also situational, physically demanding, and very rare. The most well-documented European tradition of dual wielding involves a small light sword paired with a secondary weapon held in the offhand, most commonly a parrying dagger. This pairing became especially prevalent roughly from the late 15th through the 17th centuries. Italian and Spanish fencing masters wrote extensively about this combination, and their treatises survive in significant numbers. Achille Marozzo, writing in his 1536 treatise Opera Nova, devoted considerable attention to fighting with a sword in each hand. He described techniques for using dual swords, treating it as a legitimate if specialized branch of swordsmanship. His contemporary, Antonio Manciolino, similarly included two sword techniques in his own manual published just 5 years earlier. These were respected masters operating within established fencing traditions in Bologna, one of the major centers of European martial arts instruction. Later German masters also addressed the use of a sword in each hand, further confirming that dual wielding had genuine currency across multiple European fencing traditions during this period. It's worth noting that fighting with two full-length swords was considerably rarer than the sword and dagger setup, and the physical demands were significant. Wielding two weapons of equal length and weight requires considerable strength, coordination, and ambidexterity that most fighters simply didn't possess or didn't need to develop. The sword and dagger approach was popular precisely because it was practical. It gave fighters a defensive advantage without the extreme physical requirements of managing two swords. The more common sword and dagger combination also served a very clear tactical purpose. The dagger wasn't just a backup weapon. It functioned as a defensive tool, used to parry, trap, and redirect an opponent's blade while the sword handled offensive thrusts. Some daggers were even designed specifically for this purpose, featuring wide guards or blade-catching notches that made them more effective at controlling an incoming sword. Perhaps no historical figure is more closely associated with dual wielding than Miyamoto Musashi, the legendary Japanese swordsman who lived from around 1584 to 1645. Musashi founded the Niten Ichi-ryu school of swordsmanship, which translates roughly to the school of two heavens as one. His approach involved wielding a katana in one hand and a shorter wakizashi in the other, and he wrote about this method extensively in his famous work, The Book of Five Rings. Musashi's rationale for dual wielding was characteristically direct. He argued that a warrior should learn to use a sword effectively in one hand, since there were situations in combat where two-handed grips were impractical. Training with two swords simultaneously was, in his view, a way to build the strength and independence of each arm. He also emphasized the tactical advantage of having a second weapon available for simultaneous attack and defense. The shorter wakizashi could be used to control or block an opponent's blade, while the katana delivered the decisive strike. This created a dynamic where the fighter could manage both offense and defense without retreating. However, it's important to understand Musashi's approach in its proper context. Nitanichi Ryu wasn't simply about flashy two-sword combat performed for its own sake. Many of its kata, or formal practice sequences, actually involve only a single sword. The dual-wielding component was part of a broader philosophy of adaptability and martial completeness. Musashi himself reportedly used a variety of weapons and approaches throughout his famous dueling career. Above all, his school taught students to be effective with one sword, two swords, or whatever was at hand. For all the documented traditions that exist, it's crucial to acknowledge why dual wielding never became the dominant mode of sword combat in any culture. The reasons are overwhelmingly practical. First, a shield provides far superior protection to a second sword. Throughout most of military history, the sword and shield combination was the standard battlefield pairing for anyone going into combat with a blade. This is because a shield can absorb and deflect attacks in ways that a parrying blade simply cannot match. Second, many of the most effective swords in history, from the European longsword to the Japanese katana, were designed for two-handed use. A two-handed grip provides greater leverage, more powerful cuts, and better control than single-handed wielding. There's also the significant issue of training time and physical aptitude. Developing genuine ambidextrous fighting ability requires far more training than learning to fight competently with a single weapon and a shield. Most soldiers throughout history were not professional martial artists with years of dedicated practice. They were conscripts, militia members, or warriors with limited training time. For these fighters, a shield was intuitive and immediately useful in a way that a second sword was not. Further, even for professional soldiers such as samurai, their time was likely better spent developing their archery ability or other martial skills. And that's where I need to circle back to Musashi for a moment and give some context to his life. While he was born in an era of extreme conflict, by the time he developed his martial arts philosophy and swordsmanship school, Japan was unified and at peace. While he is believed to have taken part in the final battles of the unification of Japan, he was in his youth, and this wasn't what he was known for. He was a duelist who taught swordsmanship to a class of warriors who no longer had any legitimate battles to fight against other armies. He had the luxury of developing his dual-wielding technique because battlefield skills like archery were less relevant than ever. Had he been born 50 years prior, Musashi may have stuck to developing more conventional martial arts, though admittedly, that's simply speculation on my part. The historical record makes clear that dual-wielding sword techniques weren't invented by novelists or game designers. Real warriors in multiple cultures, across multiple centuries, developed and refined methods of fighting with two blades. Italian fencing masters wrote detailed instructions for it. Miyamoto Musashi built an entire school of swordsmanship around it. But the record also makes clear that dual wielding was always a specialist's art, never the default approach to armed combat. It required exceptional skill, specific tactical circumstances, and usually the absence of better defensive options like shields or armor. The warriors who practiced it were typically elite fighters operating in particular contexts, not rank-and-file soldiers on open battlefields. It thrived in the spaces such as duels and in personal defense, in the kinds of close encounters where agility and versatility mattered more than rigid formation discipline. What's fascinating is how the historical reality, while less dramatic than fiction, is arguably more impressive. The real dual wielders of history didn't rely on superhuman reflexes. They developed their skills through rigorous training and a deep understanding of the mechanics of armed combat. The 12th century was not a comfortable time for Christian Europe. The Crusader states in the Holy Land were under constant siege, and the forces of Islam seemed to be closing in from every direction. It's in this atmosphere of deep fear and desperate hope that one of the most enduring legends of the Middle Ages took root. This was the story of Prester John, a fabulously wealthy Christian king, said to rule a powerful empire somewhere in the distant East. And it's within this legend that we find one of history's most curious disappearances, that of a man known only as Master Philip. He was a papal physician who sailed from Venice in 1177 on a mission to find Prester John and was never heard from again. To understand why Philip's journey mattered so much, we first need to understand how desperately Europe wanted Prester John to be real. The legend had its earliest known appearance in 1145, when the German bishop Otto of Freising recorded something extraordinary in his chronicle. Otto claimed he'd met a Syrian bishop named Hugh of Jabala at the court of Pope Eugene III. Hugh told him about a certain John, a Christian priest and king ruling in the Far East, beyond Persia and Armenia. According to this account, John had recently defeated the Muslim rulers of Persia in a 3-day battle and conquered their capital. He'd then tried to march toward Jerusalem to aid the Crusaders, but the swollen waters of the Tigris forced him to turn back. Otto described this John as a Nestorian Christian, a member of an Eastern church that Rome considered heretical, but still recognizably Christian. For about 20 years after Otto's chronicle, references to Prester John largely disappeared. Then, around 1165, everything changed. A letter began circulating throughout Europe, supposedly written by Prester John himself and addressed to the Eastern Roman Emperor Manuel Komnenos. It painted an astonishing picture of a kingdom beyond imagination, a land where no poverty existed and rivers ran with gold. To make his claims even more enticing, the author even claimed a fountain of perpetual youth could be found within his borders. He styled himself the most powerful ruler on earth, presiding over a domain of unimaginable wealth. This letter was the medieval equivalent of a bestseller. Over 100 different versions circulated across Europe in Latin, French, German, and Hebrew. Monks copied it, nobles treasured it, and people debated its claims for years. Modern scholars are virtually unanimous that it was a forgery written by a Western European. The tone, which addresses the emperor merely as a governor rather than by his imperial title, is something of a giveaway. Because of this, some historians have argued it may have originated as propaganda in the century after the Great Schism. Under this theory, Prester John, the theoretically most powerful Christian ruler in the world, had implicitly endorsed the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope over Orthodox Christianity. Despite its dubious origins, the letter clearly made an impression at the highest levels of the Catholic Church. Pope Alexander III, who had spent nearly 2 decades locked in a bitter struggle with Frederick Barbarossa and his rival anti-popes, took the notion of Prester John seriously. According to the papal letter itself, Alexander's personal physician, Master Philip, had recently returned from the Holy Land with remarkable news. While on pilgrimage, Philip claimed to have encountered representatives from Prester John's kingdom who said their ruler wished to embrace Roman Catholicism. This was exactly what Alexander wanted to hear. Having just been recognized as the legitimate pope at the Treaty of Venice in 1177, he saw an opportunity. On September 27th of that year, writing from the Rialto in Venice, he composed a letter addressed to the illustrious and magnificent King of the East. For much of history, it was unclear when this letter was actually written, but that problem was solved in modern times. The dating comes largely through the work of the 19th century German historian Friedrich Zarnke, who cross-referenced the date on one copy with the Venice location on another. He then examined Alexander's known movements to determine that 1177 was the only year the Pope had been in Venice on that particular date. Alexander's letter was carefully worded. He acknowledged hearing reports about the great Eastern King for some time. He expressed great pleasure at learning of Prester John's supposed desire for Catholic instruction. Interestingly, given the boastful nature of the initial letter, he included a gentle warning against boastfulness regarding wealth and power. The man chosen to deliver this letter was Master Philip himself. Described in the letter as Alexander's personal physician and servant, he was clearly someone the Pope trusted deeply. It wasn't the sort of mission one entrusted to just anyone, given the diplomatic sensitivity of the contents and the sheer uncertainty of the destination. And so Philip set out from Venice, carrying one of the most unusual diplomatic letters in history. He was bound for a kingdom no European had ever located, and that, as we now know, didn't exist at all. He sailed from Venice and vanished completely from the historical record. No chronicle notes his arrival anywhere, and no known return message was ever received. There's no account of his journey, nor has his ultimate fate ever surfaced. Master Philip simply and completely disappeared. There's a fascinating scholarly debate about whether Alexander had even read the original letter of Prester John before composing his response. Historians have noted that Alexander makes no direct reference to the letter's contents, except a brief reference to his boasting. Most importantly, he doesn't mention the fantastical claims beyond his claims of significant wealth. This has led some to suggest Alexander's letter wasn't a response to the Prester John letter at all, but a diplomatic overture based on what Philip had told him about encounters in the Holy Land. It's entirely possible Philip had met pilgrims from one of the remoter Christian communities of Central Asia while in Jerusalem. He may have interpreted their words through the lens of existing expectations about Prester John. Nestorian communities were known to exist across wide stretches of Asia at this time, and encounters with representatives of these distant churches in the Holy Land weren't unheard of. Notably, many of these Nestorian lands were deep within the heart of Central Asia, a highly difficult journey through hostile feuding tribes. As for Philip himself, the possibilities are numerous and none cheerful. Travel in the 12th century was extraordinarily dangerous. Disease, shipwreck, bandits, and simple navigational failure could have ended his journey at any point. He was heading into lands no European map could accurately depict, searching for a kingdom that existed only in the collective imagination of Christendom. Whether he perished at sea, succumbed to illness, or was slain in unfamiliar territory, we'll almost certainly never know. However, others have proposed more mundane explanations, which, given the lack of evidence, are essentially equally likely. While the records don't state clearly what Philip brought along with him on the journey, he would have necessarily carried fabulous offerings from the Pope. Some believe that he simply decided to retire in a Christian community in the Near East with his newfound wealth. There's also the idea that he may have simply turned around upon gathering more information in the Holy Land. He may have realized he wasn't properly equipped for a journey to the edge of China with the resources he had been given. He was also likely traveling with a fairly significant party, and if they didn't want to continue on, he would have had little choice but to return empty-handed. The apparent failure of Philip's mission didn't diminish the legend of Prester John in the slightest. The story simply adapted, as legends so often do. When the Mongols burst into Eastern Europe in the 13th century, the legend became entangled with reports of their conquests. A rumor spread after the Fifth Crusade in 1221 that a King David, supposedly the son or grandson of Prester John, had defeated enemy armies in Persia. By the 14th century, The presumed location of Prester John's kingdom had shifted entirely from Asia to Ethiopia. Europeans became aware of that country's status as an isolated Christian empire, surrounded by Muslim neighbors. Portuguese explorers of the 15th and 16th centuries actively searched for Prester John along the African coast. In the end, they even engaged diplomatically with Ethiopia on the basis that Prester John had been a mistranslation of one of their previous emperor's names. Master Philip's disappearance is the perfect encapsulation of the entire Prester John phenomenon. Here was a real man, sent on a real mission, carrying a real letter, in search of something fundamentally unreal. His vanishing mirrors the legend itself, tantalizing, suggestive of something just beyond reach, and ultimately without resolution. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy with a quick reminder to hit the share button and send this video to 1 or 2 friends or family members who enjoy historical content. Also, don't forget to check out the YouTube membership or the Patreon if you want to support my channel further. Oxford in the 14th century wasn't the quaint university town people imagine today. It was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The University of Oxford had been conducting formal teaching since at least 1096 and had received its own royal charter in 1248. It held enormous power over the city thanks to a series of royal privileges stretching back decades, and scholars weren't ordinary citizens. They were classified as clergy under the protection of the church, which meant they answered to the university's chancellor rather than to civil authorities for most matters. This created a 2-tiered system that deeply frustrated Oxford's townspeople, who watched scholars enjoy legal immunity, tax exemptions, and influence over local commerce. The resentment ran both ways. Students were often young, far from home, and prone to the kinds of trouble you'd expect from unsupervised young men living in a strange city. Records from medieval coroners' rolls show that scholars were involved in a staggering proportion of violent crimes in Oxford. Violent clashes between the so-called town and gown factions were practically routine. In 1209, the slaying of 2 scholars by local residents had been so brutal and violent that a group of fleeing academics went on to found the University of Cambridge. In 1314, a riot between rival student factions degenerated into what could be more accurately called a gang conflict, with dozens left dead. And in 1349, the Black Death had torn through Oxford, eliminating roughly a quarter of the university's lecturers and upending the city's economy. By February of 1355, Oxford was a city where tensions between students and locals had long reached their boiling point. On the 10th of February, 1355, the feast of Saint Scholastica, a group of university students walked into the Swindlestock Tavern right in the heart of the city. Among them were 2 clergymen, Walter de Springhouse and Roger de Chesterfield, both from parishes in the southwest of England. The tavern was a regular haunt for students, and it happened to be owned by John de Bereford, who also served as the mayor of Oxford. The students were served wine by the tavern's vintner, a man named John de Croydon, who was known to be a close associate of the mayor. They weren't impressed. They complained that the wine was poor quality and demanded something better. Croydon didn't take kindly to the criticism, and the exchange quickly turned heated. The confrontation escalated to the point where one of the students threw his cup of wine into Croydon's face. From there, things spiraled fast. Punches were thrown, more students and townspeople flooded in, and within half an hour, a full-scale brawl had erupted in the streets. The university's chancellor rushed to the scene and attempted to restore order, but he was driven back when townspeople fired arrows at him. The violence raged until nightfall, and that was only the beginning of the conflict that would follow. The next morning, the situation grew dramatically worse. townspeople rang the bell of St. Martin's Church, a traditional signal to summon locals to arms. In response, students rang the bell of St. Mary's, the university's church, rallying scholars to defend themselves. Armed groups of townspeople, carrying bows, clubs, and improvised weapons, began hunting down students across the city's streets and parishes. Scholars barricaded themselves inside university halls and fought back from upper floors as if they were under siege. But the real devastation came when reinforcements arrived from the surrounding countryside. Villagers from rural communities outside Oxford poured into the city to support the townspeople, swelling their numbers to what some estimates place at over 1,000 combatants. These combined forces launched coordinated and brutal assaults on university buildings, breaking into student accommodations, ransacking property, and much worse. There were reports of scholars being scalped and their bodies desecrated, and students were found dead in the streets and floating in the river. When word of the chaos reached King Edward III, who was staying at nearby Woodstock, he issued a proclamation forbidding any further harm to scholars or their property. It didn't matter. The mob ignored the king's order and continued the violence through a second full day. By the evening of the third day, the rioters had finally exhausted themselves and began retreating to their homes or back into the countryside. They left behind a wrecked and bloodied city. Approximately 60 members of the university had been killed, along with around 30 townspeople. In the aftermath, Edward dispatched royal judges to Oxford to investigate and assign blame. Their findings were unambiguous. Despite evidence that the students had provoked the initial confrontation, the commission placed virtually all responsibility on the townspeople and the city's municipal authorities. Mayor John de Barrowford was stripped of his office and sent to a notoriously grim prison in London, and the town's bailiffs were jailed alongside him. Oxford itself was hit with a fine of 500 marks, a punishing sum at the time. Then, on the 27th of June, 1355, Edward issued a royal charter that fundamentally reshaped the balance of power in Oxford. The university's chancellor was granted the right to tax bread and ale sold in the town, and the authority to regulate weights and measures used in local commerce. He was also given broad oversight over Oxford's economic affairs, even beyond these significant concessions. The town lost its already limited power to take legal action in any case involving a scholar or the university. This effectively rendered municipal authorities subordinate to the chancellor's court in most matters of any significant consequence. Historians have noted that Edward resolved the matter with unusual speed for the time. This was likely because he couldn't afford spreading domestic instability while facing the prospect of renewed conflict with France and Scotland. But perhaps the most striking and long-lasting consequence of the riot wasn't legal or economic. It was ceremonial. Edward imposed an annual penance on the city of Oxford that would endure for nearly 500 years. Every year on St. Scholastica's Day, the mayor, the bailiffs, and numerous townspeople, one representing each slain scholar, were required to march to the university church. There, they attended a mass for the souls of the dead students and paid a fine of 63 pence, 1 penny per official victim. During these annual processions, students reportedly jeered and pelted the humiliated officials along the route. The penance continued in various forms for centuries, with Oxford's civic leaders repeatedly and fruitlessly petitioning the crown for relief from the humiliating ritual. Generation after generation of mayors endured it. It wasn't until 1825 that the tradition finally ended. The sitting mayor, Isaac Grubb, simply refused to participate in the humiliation ritual, and the university chose not to press the matter further. The riot's legacy cast a long shadow over Oxford's identity and its internal politics. While subsequent town and gown conflicts did occur over the following centuries, none came close to the scale or ferocity of the events of 1355. The St. Scholastica Day Riot marked the last of the truly extreme bloody encounters between the two factions. Grievances were increasingly channeled through the courts or directed at the government rather than settled in the streets with weapons. Still, the underlying tension between the university and the city it dominated never fully disappeared. It took 600 years for a formal act of reconciliation to take place. In 1955, on the precise anniversary of the riot, the city of Oxford awarded the university's vice-chancellor the honorary title of Freeman of the City. In return, the university conferred an honorary doctorate in civil law upon the sitting mayor. It was a symbolic gesture, but an important one, acknowledging that the wounds of 1355 had finally healed 600 years later. Around the 6th or 5th century BC, a man known as Laozi, the founder of Taoism and author of one of the most influential philosophical texts ever written, simply vanished. He supposedly climbed onto the back of a water buffalo and rode westward through a mountain pass. After that, he was never seen again. It's one of the great enigmatic exits in history, and scholars, mystics, and storytellers have been trying to make sense of it for over 2,000 years. The disappearance of Laozi sits at the intersection of history, legend, and philosophy, and unpacking it means grappling with a figure who may have been mythological to begin with. Interestingly, some traditions even claim that this disappeared scholar and teacher would establish one of the world's major religious traditions after his journey to the West. Before we can talk about the disappearance, we need to talk about the man himself, and that's where things get complicated right away. The name Laozi isn't really a personal name at all. It translates roughly to Old Master, and it may have functioned more as a title than as a name. The earliest substantial biographical account comes from Sima Qian's Records of the Grand Historian, written around 100 BC, several centuries after Laozi supposedly lived. In that account, Sima Qian identifies Laozi as Li Er, also known as Li Dan, who served as a keeper of the royal archives in the court of the Zhou dynasty. Even Sima Qian himself seemed uncertain about the details, noting that some people confused Laozi with other historical figures. It's a rare and telling moment of historiographic humility from one of China's greatest chroniclers. Modern historians have long debated whether he was a single historical individual, a figure drawing on the lives and teachings of multiple philosophers, or a largely legendary creation. The Tao Te Ching, the foundational text attributed to him, shows evidence of having been compiled over time by multiple authors, which complicates the picture even further. Some researchers have argued that the text didn't reach its current form until the 4th or 3rd century BC, well after Laozi's supposed lifetime. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that by the time the Tao Te Ching became widely circulated, the figure of Laozi had already taken on a semi-mythological quality. The most famous account of Laozi's disappearance is the story of his westward departure. According to the tradition recorded by Sima Qian in the Records of the Grand Historian, Laozi grew disillusioned with the moral decay of the Zhou dynasty. He decided that his work couldn't repair the degeneracy he was witnessing, and his only solution was to leave civilization behind entirely. He traveled westward toward the frontier, and when he reached the Hangu Pass, the guardian of the pass recognized him as a sage of extraordinary insight. According to this tradition, this gate guard wouldn't let him pass without recording his wisdom, and the result was the Tao Te Ching. This text, comprising roughly 5,000 characters, would go on to become one of the most translated works in human history. After completing the text, Laozi continued west and vanished from the historical record entirely. This story has all the hallmarks of a founding myth: the reluctant sage, the last-minute transmission of sacred knowledge, the enigmatic departure into the unknown. It's a powerful narrative, and it clearly served important purposes for the Taoist tradition. By placing the composition of the Tao Te Ching at the moment of Laozi's departure, the story frames the text as a kind of farewell gift. It was a distillation of ultimate wisdom offered at the threshold between civilization and the wild. The westward direction is significant too. In Chinese cosmology, the West was associated with death, decline, and the setting sun. But it wasn't all negative, and it was also associated with transcendence and the realm beyond ordinary human experience. The Hangu Pass itself, situated in what is now Henan Province, became a site of pilgrimage and reverence in later centuries. It was treated as a sacred threshold between the known world and whatever lay beyond it to Taoists. Scholars and religious traditions have offered a range of explanations for what happened to Laozi after he passed through the pass. One of the most controversial theories is the so-called conversion of the barbarians theory, which emerged during the rivalry between Buddhism and Taoism in medieval China. This theory, elaborated in a text called the Huahu Jing, claimed that Laozi traveled to India after leaving China. From there, it's claimed that he either became the Buddha himself or served as the Buddha's teacher. The idea was that Buddhism was really just a foreign offshoot of Taoism, tailored by Laozi for a less sophisticated audience. In the Chinese worldview of the time, all the world was subordinate to China in terms of knowledge and sophistication. This theory was politically charged and was used as a weapon in sectarian disputes for centuries. It also allowed Chinese scholars to get around the sticky fact that one of the most influential religious and philosophical systems was of non-Chinese origin. This challenged the idea that Chinese thought and ideas were superior to all forms of barbarian teachings. By claiming Laozi as either the Buddha himself or his teacher, Buddhism was ultimately reclaimed as a Chinese system viewed through a foreign lens. It also allowed the proponents of Buddhism in China to synthesize various Chinese traditions, including Taoism, together with Buddhism. This idea was extremely controversial and officially condemned at times, and the Huahu Jing was ordered destroyed by imperial decree on multiple occasions. It was most notably destroyed during the Yuan dynasty, who were the Mongol rulers that had an extremely strong connection to a highly conservative form of Buddhism. Despite these attempts, partial copies survived in various forms, though no complete copy has ever been discovered. Other traditions within Taoism took a much more mystical approach, viewing the disappearance as a kind of deification ritual. Rather than traveling to any specific earthly destination, Laozi was said to have achieved a kind of ultimate transcendence, merging with the Tao itself. In later Taoist religious movements, particularly the Celestial Masters tradition that developed in the 2nd century, Laozi was deified as the Supreme Old Lord. In this school of thought, he became one of the highest deities in the Taoist pantheon. From this perspective, the disappearance was actually an ascension. It was a return to the cosmic source from which all things emerge, and from which he could further guide the world. In this tradition, he wasn't abandoning civilization because it couldn't be fixed, but rather because he realized his work on Earth had drawn to a close. This deification process transformed Laozi from a historical philosopher into a cosmic figure believed to have manifested multiple times throughout history. This interpretation would allow Taoists to syncretize with other religious movements extremely well, since any wise historical figure could simply be a manifestation of Laozi. For historians working outside the religious tradition, you probably won't be surprised to find that the explanations tend to be more prosaic. Some scholars have suggested that if Laozi was a real individual, he likely simply retired from public life and died in obscurity, as many people did in the ancient world. The westward journey may have been a later embellishment added to explain why there was no tomb, no death record, and no further mention of him in contemporaneous sources. Others have proposed that Laozi might have traveled to regions outside the Zhou cultural sphere, perhaps to areas that are now part of Central Asia. If this is true, he lived out his remaining years among peoples who didn't keep the kinds of records that would have preserved his story. The absence of any archaeological evidence connected to Laozi is noteworthy but not necessarily surprising. The ancient world was vast and record-keeping was uneven. Plenty of significant historical figures left little or no material trace, and that doesn't necessarily render him ahistorical. What's more revealing is that even in the centuries immediately following his supposed lifetime, Chinese writers were already uncertain about who he was and what had happened to him. The Zhuangzi, another foundational Taoist text attributed to the philosopher Zhuangzhou, includes several anecdotes about Laozi. However, it treats him in ways that blur the line between historical figure and literary device. This suggests that if there was a historical Laozi, the process of mythologizing him began remarkably early in the development of Chinese thought. Perhaps what's most interesting about Laozi's disappearance is how perfectly it aligns with the philosophy attributed to him. The Tao Te Ching is a text deeply concerned with the virtue of withdrawal, with emptiness, with the power of absence and the limitations of fixed identity. A sage who simply vanishes, leaving behind only his words, is the ultimate embodiment of the principles the text espouses. The Tao Te Ching teaches that the Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao, and a founder who can be pinned down, located, and defined wouldn't quite fit that ethos. In a tradition that prizes the ephemeral nature of the world, the founder's refusal to remain present is itself a kind of profound and enduring teaching. Whether Laozi was a real man who walked west into the mountains or a composite of several thinkers whose legacy crystallized into a single mythic figure will never be known. The empty space he left behind has been filled with theology, philosophy, political argument, and storytelling for millennia. And in a way, that's the most Taoist outcome imaginable. The sage vanishes, and in his absence, the world finds an inexhaustible source of contemplation and wonder.